The quarantine buoys went live at 0300 station time, encircling every human colony world and every registered human vessel in a cordon that the Council called a precautionary biological measure, and that I knew, standing in the dark of my office reading the directive on a screen that cast the only light in the room, was the cleanest act of political strangulation I had ever seen executed. My name is Ambassador Yemi Osei. I am 64 years old. I spent 15 years as a signals intelligence analyst for Earth's Strategic Communications Division, 10 years as the director of Earth's Deep Space Communications Authority, and the last 12 years as Earth's senior diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council's Infrastructure and Communications Committee, a committee that sounded technical and unglamorous and was, in the specific way of things that sound technical and unglamorous, one of the 2 or 3 most consequential committees in the entire Council structure. The quarantine directive had been issued by the Council's Emergency Health and Biosafety Directorate at 0247 station time, citing an unverified report from a Vethrani pathogen monitoring station that had detected anomalous biological signatures in the vicinity of a human trade vessel transiting the outer Kepler corridor. The report was unverified because the monitoring station had not completed its standard secondary confirmation sweep before the Directorate's presiding administrator had authorized the quarantine directive, which was unusual, and which the directive's supporting documentation explained as a necessary precaution given the potential severity of the indicated biological hazard. The indicated biological hazard was a bacterial strain that Earth's own biosafety team had identified, in a report filed with the Directorate 14 months ago, as a naturally occurring variant of a species-specific pathogen found in human gut flora that was completely non-transmissible to any non-human biology. The Council's Directorate had received that report. It had been logged, filed, and categorized under routine human biological data submissions. The quarantine directive had cited the pathogen monitoring report without referencing Earth's filing. I had read the directive twice. I had read the supporting documentation 3 times. I had then opened my secured communicator and verified, through a channel I will not identify, that the Vethrani reaches territorial claim filing for the Kepler Corridor Resource Zone, a filing that had been pending for 11 months, and that required under Council procedural rules that the corridor be clear of registered commercial traffic during the assessment period, had been submitted to the Council's territorial registry at 0251 station time, 4 minutes after the quarantine directive. I had stood in the dark of my office for a long time after that, looking at the 2 timestamps on my screen. Then I had sat down. I had opened a different secured channel, one that had been established 9 years ago during a briefing in a facility beneath the Nevada desert that I had reached by transport from what appeared to be a highway maintenance depot. I had transmitted a single authorization code, 12 characters, that I had been carrying in my memory for 9 years and had hoped I would never need to use. The code transmitted at 0322 station time by 0323, Project Silence. Not the weapons program, the other one. The one that had been building in the dark since the day 29 years ago, when a physicist named Dr. Lan Wei had read a paper about quantum signal propagation and asked a question that nobody in the room had been prepared to answer, began its activation sequence. I want to tell you about Dr. Lan Wei because everything that happened in the following 31 days is incomprehensible without understanding what she built, and because she has never received adequate recognition for building it. Partly because the nature of what she built made recognition difficult during the years when it mattered most. Lan was born in Chengdu in 2033, the daughter of 2 telecommunications engineers, and she spent the first 12 years of her career doing something that the Galactic Council's technology observers, who monitored human research with the specific comfortable attention of species that have been technologically superior to everything in their neighborhood for long enough to have stopped genuinely looking, had categorized as advanced signal processing research with moderate theoretical interest and no foreseeable strategic application. She was studying the Council's communication infrastructure, not to compromise it, to understand it, specifically, to understand the physical principles on which it operated, because Lan had noticed something in the mathematical descriptions of the Council's relay network that had been publicly disclosed as part of the membership transparency requirements, something that the descriptions revealed without intending to reveal. Because the people who wrote the descriptions had been describing a system they controlled and had never needed to describe defensively. The Council's relay network, the infrastructure that connected every member species' communication systems across charted space, that carried diplomatic transmissions and trade data and military coordination and the routine administrative traffic of a 400-species civilization, operated on a specific range of quantum frequency bands that had been established as a universal standard 300 years ago when the network was first built. The standard had never been updated, because updating it would have required every species connected to the network to simultaneously upgrade their communication hardware, which was a coordination problem of sufficient complexity that no one had seriously proposed it in 3 centuries. Lan's observation was this: the quantum frequency bands the Council's relay network used were a subset of the available spectrum. A small subset. The bands had been chosen 300 years ago because they were the bands that the founding 5 species' existing communication technology could access with the equipment they had at the time. 3 centuries of technological development had not changed the standard, because changing the standard was complicated and the existing standard worked. What Lan noticed was that the bands the Council's network did not use were significantly larger than the bands it did use, and that nothing in the Council's membership accords, communications regulations, or technology standards prevented a member species from developing communication technology that operated in those unused bands, because no one had thought to regulate the use of spectrum that the Council's own network had never employed. She had published a paper on quantum signal propagation in non-standard frequency bands in 2069. The Council's technology observers had categorized it as theoretically interesting, with no foreseeable practical application. Earth's Strategic Communications Division had put a team on it within 6 weeks. Lan had died 11 years ago, at 61, in a research facility outside Reykjavik that I visited once, on the occasion of a ceremony I cannot describe in detail. She had seen the network she designed reach operational status 4 years before her death, but she had not seen it used for its intended purpose, because its intended purpose was emergency deployment, and the emergency had not yet arrived. It arrived at 03:22 station time when I transmitted the activation code. The shadow web, which is the name Lan's team had given it, with the specific unadorned practicality of engineers who name things what they are, was, in simplest possible terms, a parallel communication network, not a backup of the Council's relay infrastructure. A completely independent system, built on frequency bands the Council's network had never used, operating on physical principles that the Council's signal monitoring infrastructure had not been designed to detect, connecting Earth and every human colony world and every registered human vessel through a web of relay nodes that had been deployed over 29 years in a way that I will describe in a moment. The shadow web could not carry the same traffic volume as the Council's relay network. It had not been designed to. It had been designed to carry one specific category of traffic: anything that humanity needed to communicate when the Council's network was unavailable. Emergency coordination, command traffic, the specific communications that a species needs when it has been isolated and needs to function anyway. The relay nodes, there were 2,400 of them, distributed across human space and the corridors between human worlds, were the engineering achievement that I find most remarkable about the entire program, because the solution to the deployment problem was so simple that it took 11 years to arrive at, and immediately obvious once someone had. The deployment problem was this: the Council monitored every human vessel's transit log, every human installation's equipment manifest, every significant infrastructure deployment in human space. Deploying 400 relay nodes without the Council's monitoring systems, identifying them as a parallel communication network, would require either hiding them from the monitoring systems, which was technically difficult, and left a record of the hiding, or making them look like something the monitoring systems would not flag, LAN had solved this by making them something the monitoring systems would not flag. Every shadow web relay node was also a standard astronomical monitoring station, not disguised as one. Actually one. Each node contained fully functional astronomical instruments, spectrometers, radio telescopes, gravitational wave detectors that collected and transmitted genuine scientific data. The astronomical data collection had genuine scientific value. Earth's research institutions had published 847 papers based on data from the network's astronomical instruments over the 29 years of deployment. The papers were genuine. The instruments were genuine. The data was genuine. The relay function was embedded in the node's power management systems, operating in frequency bands that the Council's monitoring equipment passed through without registering, drawing power from the astronomical instruments' own solar collection arrays in quantities too small to trigger the threshold alerts in the Council's energy monitoring systems. The Council had inspected 14 of the nodes during routine equipment certification checks over the years. Each inspection had found exactly what the node's documentation described: astronomical monitoring stations collecting genuine data. The inspectors had found nothing to flag because there was nothing to find through the methods they were using. At 03:23 station time, when the activation sequence completed, every one of the 400 nodes shifted from passive monitoring to active relay mode, and every human vessel and colony world that had been isolated by the quarantine buoys acquired a fully functional communication network that the quarantine buoys had not been designed to block, because the quarantine buoys operated on Council standard frequency bands and the shadow web operated on frequency bands the Council had never used. The quarantine had sealed the doors. It had not sealed the walls. I want to be precise about what the shadow web's activation meant in practice, because the significance of it is easy to understate if you simply hear parallel communication network and move on. The Council's quarantine had been designed with a specific strategic purpose: to isolate Earth and its colonies from the broader galactic economy and diplomatic community for a period long enough to allow the Vithrani Reach's Kepler Corridor territorial claim to be assessed and approved without human commercial traffic complicating the assessment. The quarantine's projected duration was 90 days. In 90 days, under the Council's territorial assessment procedures, the Vithrani claim could be finalized, resource extraction operations could be established, and the extraction would be sufficiently advanced that any subsequent challenge by Earth would face the additional complication of disrupting existing operations rather than preventing new ones. The quarantine's mechanism was communication isolation combined with physical transit restriction. Human vessels could not enter or leave quarantine space. Human communication through the Council's relay network was suspended. Human commercial partners could not receive human goods or transmit payments. Human diplomatic staff on Theta Station were formally suspended from committee participation for the duration of the quarantine, pending biosafety clearance. In 90 days of genuine isolation, the Vithrani plan would have succeeded. The shadow web made the isolation not genuine. Within 6 hours of activation, Earth's diplomatic mission on Theta Station, officially suspended and officially unable to communicate, had transmitted complete documentation of the quarantine's procedural irregularities, including the 4-minute gap between the quarantine directive and the territorial claim filing, to 47 independent news services, 11 minor member species diplomatic offices, and the personal secured communicators of 9 Council members who had, over the preceding years, developed relationships with Earth's diplomatic team that they preferred not to have publicly acknowledged. The documentation was transmitted through the shadow web. It arrived at its destinations through methods that each recipient's own communication infrastructure handled normally, because the signal handoff from shadow web frequencies to standard Council frequencies happened at relay points outside the quarantine zone that the quarantine buoys had not been positioned to cover. Because the quarantine buoys had been positioned to block Council standard communication traffic and the shadow web's traffic had arrived at the handoff points in frequency bands. The buoys did not monitor. Within 12 hours of activation, Earth's commercial partners, The species and institutions that had established trading relationships with human worlds over 60 years of membership had received direct communication from human commercial representatives explaining the situation and requesting that they maintain their business relationships through alternative commercial channels that Earth's trade division had established specifically for this contingency, using financial infrastructure that operated outside the Council's standard clearing systems through methods that I will not describe in detail, but that Land's program had also provided for. Within 24 hours, 3 junior member species had filed formal inquiries with the Council's procedural oversight body questioning the basis for the quarantine directive and specifically the relationship between the directive's timing and the territorial claim filing. The inquiries were filed by those 3 species independently, without coordination that could be traced, because each of them had received independent documentation and had arrived at the same conclusion through their own analysis. Within 48 hours, the independent news services that had received the documentation had published enough of it that the procedural anomaly, the 4-minute gap, the unverified pathogen report, the 14-month-old Earth biosafety filing that had not been referenced, was part of the public record in every member species' news environment. The quarantine was still in place. The buoys were still broadcasting their restriction signals on Council standard frequencies. Every official monitoring system the Council operated showed Earth and its colonies as isolated and silent. Earth and its colonies were neither isolated nor silent. On day 11 of the quarantine, the Council's Emergency Health and Biosafety Directorate received a request from its own presiding administrator to conduct the secondary confirmation sweep of the original pathogen monitoring report that should have been completed before the quarantine directive was issued. The sweep was conducted over 2 days by a team that included, at the presiding administrator's specific request, 2 independent biosafety specialists from non-founding species, a request that was unusual and that I believe reflected the presiding administrator's private assessment that the secondary sweep's results needed to be unimpeachable. The sweep confirmed what Earth's filing had stated 14 months ago. The detected biological signatures were consistent with a naturally occurring variant of a human gut flora pathogen that was species-specific and non-transmissible to non-human biology. The threat assessment rating for the quarantine dropped to 0 under the Council's emergency health and biosafety regulations. A quarantine directive, based on a biological threat that had been confirmed as non-existent, was required to be revoked within 48 hours of the confirmation. The Directorate's presiding administrator issued the revocation directive on day 13. The Vithrani Reach's legal team filed an emergency stay application with the Council's judicial administration within 2 hours of the revocation directive, arguing that the revocation was procedurally premature because the territorial assessment process that had been initiated during the quarantine period was still active, and that revoking the quarantine before the assessment was complete would introduce commercial traffic complications that the assessment's methodology was not designed to accommodate. The stay application was reviewed by a panel of 3 judicial administrators. The panel's presiding member was a Lithrani judicial officer named Councillor Osi, no relation, who had held her position for 60 years and whose reputation for procedural impartiality was the most consistent thing I had heard said about her in 12 years of attending council sessions. The stay application was denied within 6 hours. Councillor Osi's written denial cited the Emergency Health and Biosafety Regulations' mandatory 48-hour revocation window, noted that the window's mandatory nature had been established specifically to prevent quarantine directives from being maintained for reasons unrelated to their stated biological justification, and observed, in language that was precisely chosen and clearly deliberate, that the stay application's argument that the quarantine should be maintained to avoid disrupting a territorial assessment process constituted an explicit acknowledgement that the quarantine's continuation was sought for purposes other than the biological justification on which it had been issued. She had, in 600 words of judicial analysis, described exactly what had happened without stating it as a conclusion that required further evidence. The stay was denied. The quarantine was revoked. The quarantine buoys were deactivated on day 14. The territorial assessment of the Kepler corridor was a different proceeding, and its resolution took longer and was more complicated, and is a story I will describe briefly because the outcome matters, but the procedural details are extensive. The documentation that Earth's diplomatic team had transmitted through the shadow web in the first 48 hours of the quarantine had included not only the procedural anomalies of the quarantine directive, but a comprehensive filing that Earth's legal team had been preparing for 22 months. Since the moment we had first identified the Vethrani territorial claim as a preparatory action, before the claim had been formally filed, challenging the claim's basis under the Council's territorial assessment regulations, the filing was 200 pages. It had been drafted by a team of 40 legal scholars over 22 months. It had been reviewed by 3 independent legal teams who had not been told what the filing was for. Each team had confirmed its legal foundation was sound. The filing established, through analysis of the Council's territorial assessment regulations and their legislative history, that the Kepler corridor's status as an active commercial transit corridor used by registered member species, specifically used by human commercial vessels for 60 years, created a prior use claim that under the Council's own property and territorial law took precedence over any new territorial claim by a member species, regardless of the new claim's merits under other applicable criteria. The filing had been prepared before the quarantine. It had been ready to be filed for 3 months before the quarantine. We had not filed it because filing it prematurely would have warned the Vethrani legal team of its arguments and given them time to develop counter-arguments. The quarantine had been the trigger, not because it changed the legal situation, but because it had removed the last reason to wait. The filing was transmitted through the shadow web on day 2 of the quarantine and formally submitted to the Council's territorial registry through the handoff relay points outside the quarantine zone. It was filed as a formal challenge to the Vethrani territorial claim, properly formatted, with all required accompanying documentation on day 3. The territorial assessment proceeding that resulted took 14 months. It produced a ruling that I will summarize as follows. The Kepler corridor's prior use status was established. The Vethrani territorial claim was denied, and the corridor's commercial use protections were formalized under a new regulatory provision that extended the same protections to 12 other corridors where similar claims had been anticipated. The ruling was not everything Earth had sought. It did not include the formal acknowledgement of procedural misconduct in the quarantine's issuance that I had asked Earth's legal team to pursue and that they had ultimately assessed as strategically inadvisable to push for because it would have required the Council to explicitly condemn a founding species action in terms that the Founding Five's mutual defense arrangements would have made politically impossible. What we had was the corridor protection. That was real and it was permanent, and it was what mattered for the 340,000 human vessels that transited the Kepler corridor annually. The shadow web's existence was disclosed, partially, during the territorial assessment proceeding. Earth's legal team determined that the filing's chain of custody, the documentation showing that the challenge had been filed during a quarantine that was supposed to have silenced Earth's communications, required an explanation, and that the explanation required acknowledging that a parallel communication capability had existed. The disclosure was limited to operational parameters. That a network existed, that it operated on non-Council standard frequencies, that it had been built using astronomical monitoring stations that were also genuinely astronomical monitoring stations, and that it had been used to communicate during the quarantine period. The technical specifications were not disclosed. The location of more than 40 of the 2,400 relay nodes was not disclosed. The network's capacity and capabilities were not disclosed beyond what the filing's chain of custody required. The Council's Infrastructure and Communications Committee, my committee, opened a review of the shadow web's legal status under the Council's communications regulations. The review concluded, after 8 months, that the network was legal. The Council's regulations governed communication infrastructure that operated on Council standard frequency bands. The shadow web did not operate on Council standard frequency bands. There was no applicable regulation. The committee recommended that the Council develop new regulations governing non-standard frequency communication infrastructure. The recommendation was adopted in principle. The regulation development process was assigned to a working group. The working group had been meeting for 3 years as of the time of this account and had not yet produced a draft regulation, because developing a regulation that effectively addresses a technology requires understanding the technology, and understanding the technology requires the technology's developer to explain it. And Earth's position in the working group discussions had been that we were happy to assist in developing a regulatory framework, but that the framework needed to account for the legitimate security reasons why a member species might need communication capability that was not dependent on infrastructure controlled by other species. The working group discussions had been productive in the specific way of processes that are genuinely working towards something rather than performing the appearance of it. Landway's name is on a building outside Reykjavik. The building is the Landway Institute for Advanced Signal Research, which conducts genuine astronomical research using instruments that are not also relay nodes, because the shadow web's relay function has been disclosed, and the astronomical cover is no longer needed. The Institute also conducts research into quantum signal propagation in non-standard frequency bands, which is research that has produced 17 papers and 3 significant theoretical advances in the 4 years since it became possible to do it openly. Her son attended the Institute's dedication ceremony. He is an architect. He had not known, while she was alive, what she actually did in the facility outside Reykjavik, because what she actually did could not be told to anyone who did not have the relevant clearance, and he had not. He had known that she was a researcher, that she worked long hours, that she cared about her work with a quality of commitment that he had not fully understood until he was an adult and had found his own work that he cared about in the same way. He stood in front of the building for a long time at the dedication. I was present. I had been present at the ceremony because I had known Lan, and because I had been the one who transmitted the activation code, which meant that I had been the person who put to its intended use the thing she had spent 29 years building. He found me afterward and said, "She used to say that the most important network is the one you have when all the others go down." I thought about 0300 station time and the quarantine buoys going live and the dark office and the 2 timestamps on my screen, and about 0323 station time when the activation completed and every isolated human vessel and colony world suddenly had a voice again. She was right, I said. I have a house now in Accra, which is where my father's family has been for 4 generations, and which is where I had always meant to spend more time than the 12 years of council work allowed. I spend more time there now. The house has a garden that looks east, and in the early morning, I can see the signal towers of the city's communication infrastructure on the horizon, which I find I cannot look at without thinking about frequency bands. My granddaughter is 11 years old. She came to stay last spring and asked me, in the specific direct way she has of asking things she has been thinking about since before she arrived, what a quarantine was. I explained it to her in the terms appropriate for 11 years old. A quarantine is when someone decides you cannot talk to anyone else. They put up walls around you. They try to make you silent. She thought about this. But you could still talk, she said. You told me. Yes, I said. We could still talk. How? I thought about Landway reading a paper about quantum signal propagation and noticing that the Council's relay network used a small subset of the available spectrum, and about 29 years of genuine astronomical research that was also something else, and about 2,400 relay nodes that were completely what their documentation said they were, and also something more. Someone read the regulations very carefully, I said, and found the frequency bands that nobody had claimed. She thought about this with the serious expression she uses for things that are both simple and large. And you use those ones, she said. We used those ones, I said. She seemed satisfied. She went back to what she had been doing, which was building something in the garden with materials whose purpose I had not asked about, because in my experience, the best things built in gardens are the ones adults do not ask too many questions about. I sat in the morning light and watched her work and thought about the specific quality of freedom that comes not from being strong enough to break the walls they build around you, but from having already built, quietly and patiently and in frequency bands nobody thought to claim, the voice they did not know you still had. The quarantine had lasted 14 days. The shadow web had been building for 29 years. The walls they built took 14 days to come down. The voice they tried to silence had never stopped.